Good evening and welcome to the new school. My name is Karen Coney. I'm the director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics and delighted to welcome SculptureCenter here for another round of their Subjective Histories of Sculpture talks, which tonight will be delivered by Nairy Baghramian. I remember distinctly a few of your striking installations, partially for their exquisite titles. Among their work is one that was presented at Sculpture Project in Münster in 2007 and was entitled Entr'acte, the thing in between actions, the intermission, the thing that's not really supposed to be. And this piece was assertively physical, despite what one might expect of something that's really not it quite yet, or an entr'acte. It was marked by an installation that involved partition screens, frames, fabrics, and mirrors, and reflected very clearly on display and materiality. At the Vera List Center for this semester and the next 2 semesters, we're focusing on notions of thingness, as we call it, and are exploring new understandings of materialism, often grouped generally under the heading of speculative realism or object-oriented ontology. So you can imagine just how pleased I was when SculptureCenter proposed a talk with Nairy Baghramian. I'd like to thank SculptureCenter and in particular Mary Cerudi, the Executive Director and Chief Curator, who will now properly introduce the artists. Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you all for coming. I want to begin by thanking the New School and Karen Coney for having us here. It's been, I think we figured out 6 years or 7 years now we've been doing this series, and it's been quite fruitful. I think we've had an amazing series of talks by a lot of artists that have given us a lot to think about, I guess. When we started the series and titled it Subjective Histories of Sculpture, it was a way of inviting artists to come and talk not necessarily about their work, but the things that they think about that ultimately inform the work. I wanted just, on the note about the series, the next talk is on April 9th. It will take place at SculptureCenter, and it's Josephine Mexviper. So we'd love to have you, but remember that it's at SculptureCenter, not at the New School. I also want to thank Kristen Chapa, who's our curatorial associate, who has coordinated the series on our end at SculptureCenter. Nairy, I kind of echo Karen's comments about Nairy's work, because I think I also saw that piece in Münster and then in Venice, and I think one of my reaction in both cases, without knowing that it was the same artist, was kind of puzzlement. It's kind of an amazing thing, I think, in an era when we all look at so much work and we see work in these contexts where it's brought together for us, and often we see, we recognize a style, and it's our job to know what to do with an art object, how to contextualize it, where it belongs in our understanding of what's happening in the conversation. And I think to encounter an object that you don't quite know what it is and what it's talking about yet, or that really makes you question your own understanding of what you're experiencing, is an incredible feat. So that's how sort of I came to become a fan, I'll say. So to get to the more formal introduction, as Karen promised, Nairy Baghramian was born in Isfahan. I'm having a really hard time articulating tonight, I'm sorry. Isfahan, Iran, and moved to Berlin as a teenager, where she still lives. Her practice examines political and social systems of power, and very much engages questions of context and institutional framing and production of contemporary art. She works with sculpture and installation and occasionally photography, and has also written some interesting texts as well. I would recommend you might take a look at some of those. So her exhibition history is also quite impressive. She had a 2-person show with Felita Barlow at the Serpentine Gallery in 2009, I believe. she's exhibited at the Kunsthalle Basel in Switzerland, the Schinkel Pavilion in Berlin as part of the 5th Berlin Biennale, the Stedelijk Museum, and many other venues. And I'm very pleased that she'll be returning to New York to do a show at SculptureCenter in January 2013. So you will get to revisit this in a little, within the year, let's say. So with that, I want to turn things over to Nairy.
Thank you very much for the invitation and having me here. And thank you very much for your generous introduction. I will read my text because I think it's more sure to read my text than to talk in English. I'm not going to show any images of any work because not that is a method, because it doesn't fit to my talk today. It's not a position, but if I would do another talk, I would definitely show some images. But for this talk, it's not necessary. Subject to object and vice versa. I want to use this opportunity to try and raise some potentially provocative ideas about subject-object relation in the field of contemporary art. In doing so, I'm aware that I'm also, and of course, implicated myself, but as I believe that artistic discourse is of fundamental importance, I also think that artists should risk controversy and stake contentious claims rather than seeing themselves just advocates of their own work. In the last few years, it seems to me that the status of a work of art had risen beyond that of mere autonomous existence to the point where works are sometimes treated like quasi-subjects capable of their own autonomous thinking. From a philosophical point of view, this might be an interesting approach, and actually I do like that issue. In practice, however, the consequence is that its autonomous thinking work begins to take action by itself as well. It might, for instance, apparently enter into direct dialogue with the curator, generating a relationship in which art objects, including image-based works, of course, function like active purveyors of their own alliances and affinities with other objects. One sometimes gets the impression that a work of art can speak, live, and even outlive the artist, and hence also artistic discourse. I believe that this work turned subject is a kind of monster. Curators, art historians, and critics sometimes nurse this monster by talking about the work as an isolated entity, thus effectively releasing artists from their responsibility to contribute to current discourse. This tendency is further promoted by the growing silence of the artist subject, who thereby threatens to turn themselves into a self-mystifying object. This objectified artist subject seems willing to effectively annul him or herself in order to become a silent producer. I have to remind that I'm always included when I'm describing the situation. That turns the artist into something like a fetish object, with the only agent in art discourse left being curators, commentators, and market players exercising control. Faced with this, traditionally the self-specifying artist might seek to lend legitimacy to their status as an artist by appealing to immortality or the infinite, a state of being, and making beyond daily concerns of the world. But in doing so, what happens to the discursive potential of art? My point is not that we need to re-debate questions about the autonomy of the work of art over and over again. But still, should we take a critical view of the fact that these days works of art have actually returned to a status of such autonomy, considering that had they retained it to begin with, there would have been no institutional critique and no debate over aesthetic experience in general? This debate is true considering the possibility of the work existing as thought objectified, but only in their relation to the beholder and to their institutional and social conditions. I'm thinking, for example, of Robert Morris' untitled Box for Standing from 1961, in which the beholder is invited to stand inside a life-size upright rectangular wooden box to become part of the work and institution exhibiting it. At the same time, the empty box marks the absence of the agent subject. If the idealizing view of the idea of a work's autonomy effectively renders that work a subject in its own right, the structure surrounding the work of art, of which we as beholders are part, come under threat. We are as though under the work's spell, responding to it like schizophrenics. At the same time, there is a danger that an art critic comes to believe that it is enough to negotiate matters in intimate exchange with the work alone. Now it speaks for itself, now it's part of his or her concept. The work of art becomes a projection screen that talks back. This is necessary, but should only be a starting point. Time frame. Recently I saw the 60s, an exhibition of works by Claes Oldenburg in Vienna, and thought it was really refreshing with regard to the issues I'm addressing. Created by Achim Hochdorfer in close collaboration with Oldenburg, the show dissolved the autonomy of individual works, whose meaning instead grew out of the ensemble in which they were embedded. To my mind, the exhibition functioned like a study, both in the rhetoric of the rooms and the placement of the works, and a connection were established by deliberately tying everything back onto their specific history. The work of art was not presented as a spectral, free-floating existence detached from everything else. By connecting the art to the contemporary historical and socio-political discourse of the 90s, Hochdorfer allowed meanings to emerge in dialogue. Thus it became apparent, for instance, that Oldenburg's formal decisions were deeply motivated by the circumstances of his time, and the discourse of the 60s remains worthy of our interest today. Taking the train of thought demonstrated by this exhibition to its logical conclusion, it seems to me that there cannot be such a thing as an autonomous work of art. Art must always be seen in relation to its context. In its encounter with the beholder, the work of art exercises an indirect influence on cultural habits, drawing our attention by contradicting or rejecting them, and thus providing a frame for the transformative power of aesthetics and politics. Why this question now? Setting out from the hypothesis that what we see looks back at us, a claim put forward in a book of the same title by Didi Uberman, and thinking about the 60s and minimal art, for example, Donald Judd's essay about the color red, we can see that the writings of minimalism were sometimes quite at odds with the art it produced. To my mind, that wasn't a bad thing. The most exciting debates within minimalism were those the artists themselves provoked by generating contradictions. These contradictions in the discourse-object relations, I think, generated parallel works that permeate my attitude to minimalism and are capable of turning monotone understandings of minimalism on their head. I would like to read a quote from Donald Judd's essay. I will consider some of the questions of art, not primarily from the outside, but as they occur in my work. An artist is certainly not without ideas and principles, but these cannot be completely formulated beforehand, before the work is developed and then simply embodied. It is an essential of art that the process of making it and the use of all that comprises, it influences, suggests and enforces ideas and qualities. The ideas and qualities and the materials and techniques build each other. A red seems to have a particular quality of its own. In the work, it retains that quality, and yet it is altered and amplified by the context. Its original quality may have suggested alternation. The idea or quality desired may have required the red. End quote. It was not just object strategies or pure production that were at issue at that time. The simultaneous discourse enabled artists to question what they were doing and to engage in contentions. In the 90s, a period when the 60s were reconsidered, generally, we also saw the prevalence of a critical approach to the work of art and skepticism about artist subjects. When the artist spoke, he or she did so primarily as a socio-political persona, a cultural producer who sought to generate discourses. The aim was to try circumnavigate the problem of the marketable art object. Ironically, the works produced in parallel or as a byproduct would later be reclassified as works of art. Moving to the present, these days artists have begun to introduce a great number of references into their works, effectively prehistoricizing themselves, me included. Some observers object to this tendency, arguing that artists are trying to secure themselves and produce surplus values by means of the strategic deployment of references, while seeing themselves as mystified producers whose work needs to be decoded by third parties. This may be why artists have become ever more cautious in their statements, a reticence in which they have now made themselves comfortable. Curators and critics, in fact, find this emphasis or reference rather congenial. The works are understood to convey a shared interest, but critics are better at articulating it. Some critics, maybe some are here, will feel honored, but it's not exactly what is intended. As a consequence, third-party commentators, not artists, are at a discursive advantage, one that sometimes gives the impression that artists now devise their production with the interests of critics and curators in mind. The result, for example, are a plethora of unpositioned mystical art objects and the fashionability of work with a dubious formal resemblance to process-based art and arte povera. What motivates this rapprochement is the fact the only art statement being made by the artist here is the bare fact of their making or doing. The term process-based, however, to my mind, thus loses the quality it has in the past. Today, the production process is what apparently matters and supplants the process of thinking and articulating. Contemporary experience shows that the less the artist speaks, the more autonomous the work becomes. For instance, it has become a stock trope to say that we should let the work speak for itself. The artists themselves speak only because, in the best of cases, they can help produce the surplus value for their work. The enormous circulation of works and their pictures in social network is taxing. The artist begins to feel like a machine. Once again, the boundary between subject and object is blurred, but not as an intentional technique, as for example in Andrea Fraser's work Untitled from 2004, where she illustrates the artist's marketing of herself through the mechanism of capitalist exploitation by taking it to the extreme of having sex with a collector. This objectification of the artist is just collateral damage in the struggle for visibility. Of course, there have always been and still are artists, such as said Andrea Fraser, Lutz Bacher, Mary Kelly, Joe Spence, Jutta Kötter, Gilbert and Josh, Jerry Bibi, or Christian Philipp Müller, who continue to pursue, besides their art production, the fundamental goal of raising questions pertinent to the art system and the performative act, or declaring themselves part of the art. In these instances, the person, the artist as a subject, is an essential component of the artist's practice. The work of art, in the widest sense of the term, insofar as it is reflective, must be regarded as performative. The performative process is initiated by the encounter between beholder and work in the context of the latter's presentation. The interrelationship this encounter subsequently generates can change fundamental attitudes regarding cultural issues. In the next step, animates us to think beyond the pure subject-object relation and its dialectic. An alternative example might be Zagenskan's recent Berlin film Die kleine Baustelle and her recent exhibition of sculptures Hallelujah 2012, which features an assembly of animated objects that all look like a sort of setting for a film. Her exhibition could also be understood as a clear assertion about the idea of what it means to be an artist now. As Dietrich Dietrichson noted in a review of the show, the only person suitable to be an artist, the implicit argument goes, is someone who can transcend the boundaries of genres and make themselves at home in the world of ostensibly autonomous objects as though in a communicative language. Things to practice, writing and discourse. In rare instances, the need to participate actively in generating discourse is imposed on the artist from outside. For instance, when he or she is approached by a journal such as Texte zur Kunst, which asks artists to articulate reasoned views about something other than their own production, and it's actually comparable to the invitation here in the new school. I think that's an important challenge, particularly because many artists today prefer to style themselves as victims of these discourses rather than participate actively in them. Last fall, I was asked to say something about feminism, an issue the public debate often described as having been laid to rest. I would like to read an excerpt from my text, titled, "You Go First." Most recently, we have observed a return to curatorial assertion that largely rely on the ostensibly significant facts and either build on the feminist debate without articulating their own stake or disregard it altogether. The results are shows that once again reproduce traditional stereotypes about femininity. Exhibitions of the 60s and 70s, such as Issue, held at the ICA London in the 1980s, and created by Lucy Lippard, which featured artists such as Margaret Harrison, Mary Kelly, Nancy Spiro, Mae Stevens, Kate Walker, and Mary Yates, or Künstlerinnen International, 1877 to 1977, held at NGBK Berlin in 1977, which included works by Barbara Morgan, Helen Frankenthaler, Ulrike Oettinger, Miriam Shapiro, Caroline Schneemann, Judy Chicago, Valley Export, Hannah Wilke, and others, shows that fosters substantial debate over feminist issues are at once assessed as purely historical phenomena. The ties that bind certain genres, such as performance, video, and participatory arts, to historical context imply the renewed danger of a dualism pitting such artistic practices against their ostensible opposites, the media of sculpture and painting. The latter, it is suggested, can speak for themselves by virtue of their form and can stand the test of tempestuous times, thanks to their physical permanence and historical standing. The consequence of this problematic characterization is that painting and sculpture are described today as incapable of contributing to the debate over feminism or more generally of being a vehicle of political content. Works that initially became visible by virtue of that debate now appear as the products of an anonymous artistic subject, catering to the promise that we can escape the haunting discontent of the category of gender. Here, by contrast is what Judith Butler wrote in Gender Trouble. The prevailing law threatened one with trouble, even put one in trouble, all to keep one out of trouble. Hence, I concluded that trouble is inevitable, and the task how best to make it, what best way to be in it. End of the quote. Timing versus placing. Restoring the subject-object relation also urgently requires the sustainability of the work that institutions do. Institutions must remain the sites where important discourses are conducted. Today's budget cuts and the resulting constraints must not endanger the lasting preservation of institutional structures. The current boom of biennials, triennials, manifestos, documentas, etc., unfortunately can also pose a threat to institution and its lasting quality. Of course, I'm intentionally exaggerating their negative impact to make a more general point. I'm thinking of mega exhibitions conceived as spectacular events used primarily as a way of summing up a period and reflecting on trends in art, also with a view to setting signals for the future. In today's globalized world, you can go and see several of these shows at any given time. The consequence is a permanent déjà vu. The same works come up again and again. Timing supersedes placing, a development that parallels the difference between the definition of process I mentioned earlier. This global trend setting cannot be stopped, so we need to think harder about these temporary grand exhibitions. Works of art must not just be seen as subordinate to the overarching theme of the show they happen to be in. Such specific. Thinking of institutions and timing brings me to the question of such specificity and back to the Oldenburg's work in Moomag in Vienna, which I had heretofore only seen displayed in institutions as autonomous centerpieces in exhibitions. I think this show will travel also to Walkout Center and MoMA in New York. The usual form of presentation only fulfilled expectations about the Oldenburgian pop art object. In contrast, the selection and display of the work included in the 60s show contradicted this expectation with great precision. The individual works were set back into their historical and local context, as I said before, establishing the performative nature of Oldenburg's approach. The takeaway assertion of the exhibition was that it's overly simplistic to place his oeuvre solely in the context of pop art. The curator's close attention to context and his efforts to bring out a different perspective let me see that Oldenburg's work had much more in common with, say, Eva Hesse's than I had thought. Engaging with minimal art as well seemed to have been much more important to him than merely meeting the parameters of pop art. So Oldenburg's early work, surprisingly enough, drew my attention back to the importance of such specificity. The following is a short text I recently wrote on this subject. A sense of the house. If one assumes that a work of art was first and foremost an autonomous object extracted from its original context, one that has been transferred to the mode of representation through its exposure in an institution specially conceived for this purpose, and thus becoming what was later validated as art in museums, then this raises the question of to what extent similar mechanisms are applied in the opposite direction today. Historically, the need to build a place for art, a museum or other institution associated with the circulation of art objects, thus establishing a semiotic for the art ideological structure, was originally triggered by the desire to display objects brought by travelers which were considered significant to the place where they were found. Consequently, artists began to investigate buildings constructed for this purpose, along with the resulting conditions of the exhibition, in order to establish that, like the metaphor of the house in philosophical paradigms, constant return is inevitable. With this, the discourse inherent to the artwork becomes inseparable from the surroundings parameters of the presentation, and as such can be experienced as a specific site. Site specificity is therefore to be understood as an artistic method that does not presume the autonomy of the artwork, but rather one that reflects on contextual conditions and referential possibilities relating to various economical, political, social, and cultural registers. This can be tested on the basis of institutions and their own networks of conditions. The increasing tendency of both curatorial and artistic practice, that is, to connect less to the specific relationship between time and space, and instead allow for large group exhibitions conceived hastily under tight deadlines, can all too easily transform artworks into in-demand, easy-to-manage exhibition pieces. With this, site-specific negotiations threaten to become obsolete, and self-reflexive institutional concepts are at risk. To put this bluntly, this means that the discursive artwork will travel in reverse, and having landed in a blind spot, can only hope to be discovered purely as an exhibit. Le mépris, contempt. To summarize, today's proximity between subject and objects tends to lead to confusion between the two, and to misattributions where are left with an exhibit that is adrift, and a producer who has fallen silent, a creator without qualities. When faced with this issue, it is important to remember that in the past, some people used to have an alternative, positively exaggerating idea about the fusion of art objects and artist subjects. I'm thinking of all kinds of wild groups of artists, actors, writers, women publishers, drag queens, etc., who shared an interest in social utopias and created works beyond their aesthetic ambitions, directed as weapon against repression and conformity. Even people like Andy Warhol, even though he's admittedly perhaps the evil of all evils in terms of thinking about subject and object and the artistic production of discourse. I would like to end this talk with the idea that the culture of change they have propelled is of significance to our political reality even today.
Je pense que j'irai chez maman. Mais après, je sais pas.
Viens me chercher si tu veux. À 4 heures. À Cinecittà. Je veux discuter avec cet Américain.
Oui, peut-être. Tu vois mes pieds dans la glace?
Oui.
Tu les trouves jolis?
Oui. Très.
Et les filles, tu les aimes?
Oui.
Tu les aimes mes genoux aussi?
Oui. J'aime beaucoup tes genoux.
Et mes cuisses?
Aussi.
Tu vois mon derrière dans la glace?
Oui.
Tu les trouves jolies mes fesses?
Oui. Très. Ça va.
Et mes seins? Tu les aimes?
Oui. Énormément.
Doucement, pas si fort.
Un peu plus.
Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-ce que tu préfères? Les seins? La poigne de main? Qu'est-
Je sais pas. C'est pareil.
Et mes épaules, tu les aimes?
Oui.
Moi, je trouve qu'elles sont pas assez rondes. Et mon visage.
Aussi.
Tout. Ma bouche, mes yeux, mon nez, mes oreilles.
Oui, tout.
Donc, tu m'aimes totalement.
Oui. Je t'aime totalement, tendrement, tragiquement.
Moi aussi, Paul.
Is there some question? Great, I'm done. The film. Well, you asked
what was
I
the
chose
choice for the fragment you just played?
Because actually there's a merge between subject and object, and the projection on object, and because in this film, that scene was actually at the beginning not part of the film, and it was not part of Godard's script. And Ponty, the producer, said, "We just do this film if you show Brigitte Bardot naked." And I think this solution, it is kind of in the art praxis as well. We do criticize things, but we know we are in the middle of it. And the solution Godard and Brigitte Bardot solved out is amazing. It's turned out the whole subject into the object, and the object again in the mirror, and we are looking into the mirror. And it also marks our desire to create a kind of side places. You know, we wouldn't. I mean, actually, that scene is done for us. Like, the projection on us that we need to see this. So it's the same theme as I was thinking about subject and object.
Hey, I just wanted to, thinking about this question of the institution, let's say, and I'm just going to just bring up a very small example. At MoMA, for instance, there's one room with kind of smallish doors, I guess, and it's got all of the some works by Rauschenberg, Twombly, and Jasper Johns in this room. And I'm just wondering about then how you think to kind of solve these issues, this problem that we're in, I guess, as an artist who then can kind of perhaps expect maybe an artwork to fall into this kind of autonomy within this kind of museum structure. What are some good devices, I guess, to deal with that? For instance, in this room, there is, of course, this wall text, and it doesn't mention at all their intimate relationship. It doesn't mention this contextuality of their homosexuality or anything in this regard. And so I'm just wondering if the artist is then somehow responsible for their own textual, like you say, with Donald Judd, et cetera. But are there, yeah.
I'm actually not against that curatorial shows can be set up in a wrong way, because I have the... I mean, artists are not alive. If they would be there, they had to solve this problem. But of course, it's the responsibility of MoMA or the curators who are working there. But actually, we can't just write an email, or we can't. I mean, as you said it today, we have to discuss all these points, and things are changing. It's not that art history is fixed and is written forever. So maybe the next curator will change the wall text. I hope so.
Hi. Nairy, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the issue of access when you're talking about the wave of reference in art, especially as well as sort of a social awareness, how those two things sort of create a divergent viewing experience or access point for viewers who may or may not have art historical context.
I'm not against references. I'm actually pro-references, but I think they have to be used in a way that it makes sense. It has to. We were talking actually yesterday about Rosa Marie Trockel's work and how she could emerge, as it was an Artist Institute, emerge references, quotes, interest in other medias. It has to be kind of reasonable while you are doing it. And also, if you do some references, you have to be interested to know what you're talking about. So you have to do the work. If it's the answer of your question. I actually really hated in the last years that mostly curators said, "Oh, I don't like this work of young artists. They do refer to many things, but at least they do refer to things." I'm actually right now against artists who says, "No reference is nothing. I'm just doing a work." I actually changed my mind about that. Great.